This president became the first president in history to refuse to pay SNAP benefits during a shutdown. I took him to court. We won. We got partial benefits. And then when a court ordered him, no, pay full benefits, he actually went to the Supreme Court so he could not feed people, using starving Americans as leverage in a political dispute. Then we come out of the shutdown, and he's willing to do it again. He's telling states that if you do not share the personal protected information of every single one of your Kentucky citizens that's on SNAP, just give it to the federal government for whatever they want, we're going to shut off your SNAP benefits. Well, they tried that before. This time they're saying it's for fraud. Last time they said it was for immigration. It's still the personal information that is protected of every Kentucky citizen. They're not entitled to it. We went to court. We got an injunction saying they couldn't turn off SNAP benefits. Now they're trying again. We will fight them. We will beat them.
You just heard Governor Andy Beshear lay out a scorching indictment of authoritarian cruelty masquerading as fiscal prudence. And we need to sit with what was actually said here, because this is not hyperbole. This is not partisan theater. This is a Democratic governor telling us in unvarnished terms that the Trump administration became the first in history to refuse to pay SNAP benefits during a shutdown. And let that sink in for a moment, because in the entire history of this republic, through wars and depressions and every conceivable calamity, no president had ever weaponized hunger itself until now, until this administration decided that starving poor families was an acceptable negotiating tactic. And before you think this is just about bureaucratic wrangling over emergency funds, understand that federal judges called this unlawful and noted that irreparable harm will begin to occur, and terror would be caused to families about whether they could feed their children next month. And we are talking about more than 40 million Americans who suddenly face the prospect of no food assistance whatsoever, because one man decided political leverage mattered more than human survival. Now here is where this gets even more insidious, and I need you to understand the full scope of what Beshear is revealing, because there were emergency funds sitting around that the president could use to fund the SNAP program, and all he had to do was be willing to do it, and legal experts made this crystal clear, saying the administration is violating the law and choosing not to spend money it has available to pay for food for poor people, and this was not some novel legal interpretation, because during Trump's first term, the Government Accountability Office issued a report confirming he paid for these benefits before during a previous shutdown. So the infrastructure, the precedent, the legal authority all existed, but this time the calculation was different. This time the cruelty was the point. And the Trump administration said it would restart SNAP food benefits, but only at 50% of normal payment, with lengthy delays before benefits would reach families who depend on this assistance to survive. But wait, because the authoritarian playbook never stops at one atrocity, it builds and compounds, and here comes the second bombshell that Beshear drops on us, which is that Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins is now demanding states provide data including names and immigration status of aid recipients, and says the cooperation is needed to root out fraud. But let us be absolutely clear about what is happening here, because parsam nagar confectet. Attorneys argue the administration has all but told us their intention is to comb this data and use it for unlawful purposes that include immigration enforcement, and the demand is part of a campaign to amass Americans' sensitive personal data and misuse that data for unauthorized purposes, given that the IRS and Department of Health and Human Services have already agreed to share private information with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and so we are watching in real time the construction of a surveillance state apparatus that uses the desperate need for food as a trap to ensnare vulnerable families and funnel them into the deportation machine. Think about what this means in practice, because some legal immigrants who receive SNAP benefits may lose their legal status in the future, given that the administration is trying to reverse Biden-era immigration programs, and for years advocates and state agencies tried to reassure immigrant families that it was safe to sign up for assistance if they met eligibility requirements. And now, people need to know their information will be used only to administer the program and won't put them or their family members at risk. But the federal government's demand for unfettered access raises serious privacy concerns and the potential that information will be weaponized against people who would go hungry without assistance. And this creates a chilling effect where mixed-status families, eligible citizens with undocumented relatives, will simply stop seeking help they desperately need because the risk of family separation outweighs the risk of hunger. And that is the design that feature, not the bug of this barbaric policy. Now, a federal judge in San Francisco issued a preliminary injunction in October blocking the administration from withholding federal SNAP funding from states that refused to provide the requested data. 22 states and the District of Columbia sued over the request, and the parties agreed to give states until December 8 to respond, but the Trump administration is openly defying the courts because Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins said they are planning to block Democratic-led states from accessing billions of dollars in federal funding, and as of next week will stop moving federal funds into those states until they comply. And this is where we need to recognize what constitutional crisis looks like, because when the executive branch simply announces it will continue illegal actions despite court injunctions, we have crossed a threshold into lawlessness that makes a mockery of separation of powers, and the fraud justification is such transparent nonsense, because experts say that while there is certainly fraud in a $100 billion a year program, the far bigger problems are organized crime efforts to steal benefit cards, not wrongdoing by beneficiaries. Rollins cited information saying 186,000 deceased people are receiving benefits and 500,000 are getting benefits more than once, but her office has not released detailed data on how much in benefits obtained by error or fraud are actually being used, and we already have a National Accuracy Clearinghouse created in 2023 that allows states to search each other's recipient databases to combat fraud, so the infrastructure for legitimate fraud prevention already exists without creating a massive federal surveillance database. But that was never the real purpose, was it? Because this raised suspicions. It is part of the Trump administration's efforts to create a master database to surveil and track immigrants, and we know DOJ is combining sensitive data from across agencies including Social Security Administration, Department of Homeland Security, and Internal Revenue Service, to create a data tool that can help track and arrest immigrants they want to remove. Let me connect this to the broader architecture of oppression being constructed right now, because the big beautiful bill extends sweeping tax cuts for billionaires totaling $4.5 trillion over 10 years at the cost of major cuts to social programs, and is in direct opposition to the populist economic message that Trump and Vance ran on. And the new law changes how people with low income access government support from health care to food assistance, making the American welfare state already small in comparison to European countries, even smaller and less generous. And this is not random chaos. This is ideological warfare against the most vulnerable dressed up in the language of efficiency and fraud prevention, while the bill targets many groups of lawful immigrants by denying their access to social welfare. And the through line here is unmistakable, which is the deliberate immiseration of anyone who lacks the power to resist. Beshear's defiance matters here because he represents the kind of resistance that must be replicated across every level of government, and a federal judge ruled in favor of Kentucky and 24 other states and demanded that funding be restored. Beshear signed an executive order declaring a state of emergency and directing $5 million from the Budget Reserve Trust Fund to food banks, because he understood that when the federal government abandons its moral obligations, states must step into the breach. But let us be clear about what it means that we need emergency measures to feed our own citizens, because the president is holding them hostage. Beshear said, "From the miracle of fishes and loaves to the Last Supper, my faith teaches me we are called to feed and care for each other, and our president and leaders should be focused on fighting hunger, not causing it." And that moral clarity, that unflinching naming of what this actually is, represents exactly the kind of language we need right now. Because here is what keeps me up at night, which is that every single one of these attacks on SNAP is a test case for how far authoritarianism can push before it meets meaningful resistance. In Trump's first term, his administration tried again and again to take food away from hungry families, and although these efforts were largely unsuccessful, the more than 42.6 million Americans who rely on these benefits now face even greater threats, as conservative Republican lawmakers see safety net programs as prime targets for budget cuts, and Trump selected multiple authors of Project 2025 to join his administration, and the playbook suggests enacting major SNAP rule changes pursued in Trump's first term. And we know from history that authoritarian movements do not stop when they succeed. They expand, they metastasize, they find new targets and new ways to inflict suffering in service of their ideological project. What we are witnessing is the transformation of the administrative state into an instrument of targeted punishment, where access to basic survival depends on political compliance and demographic acceptability. 22 states and Washington, D.C. sued, arguing the data request was illegal, and that information gathered would likely be used for an immigration crackdown, because everyone understands the subtext here, which is that food assistance is being converted from a universal human right into a surveillance tool to identify and ultimately remove populations deemed undesirable by the regime. And when New York Governor Kathy Hochul asked, "Why is the Trump administration so hell-bent on people going hungry?" she was articulating the question that should haunt every American with a conscience, because there is no policy rationale, no fiscal necessity, no legitimate governance purpose that explains this. It is pure malice. it is cruelty as statecraft. It is the deliberate engineering of human suffering to consolidate power and terrorize communities. And the temporal dimension matters too, because this was the first time in history SNAP funding was frozen during a government shutdown, which means Trump created a new precedent, a new tool in the authoritarian toolkit that future administrations can now deploy, and every time a norm is shattered, every time an unthinkable act becomes thinkable, the Overton window shifts, and what was once unconscionable becomes merely controversial. Past presidential administrations have continued dispersing funds for SNAP during prior government shutdowns, but Trump decided political brinkmanship over a wall over his vanity project was worth starving millions, and he knew exactly what he was doing, because Trump wrote, "I do not want Americans to go hungry, just because the radical Democrats refuse to do the right thing and reopen the government, while simultaneously refusing to use the legal mechanisms at his disposal to feed those Americans, which is gaslighting on a civilizational scale." Think about the families caught in this nightmare, because about 42 million lower-income Americans rely on SNAP to help buy groceries with an average monthly benefit of about $190 per person, or a little over $6 a day, and we are talking about children, we are talking about elderly people, we are talking about people with disabilities, and nearly 39% of recipients are children and adolescents under 18 who had no say in the political disputes that were being used to justify their hunger. In McCreary County, Kentucky, more than 40% of people rely on SNAP benefits, and the director of a food pantry there said, "I don't think we've ever had this urgency and worried about where food's going to come from and how we're going to feed people. We've never had anything to quite compare to." And that is a woman who has worked at a food center for 25 years saying she has never seen anything like this level of crisis and desperation. What Beshear is documenting for us is not just policy disagreement, it is a systematic attempt to dismantle the social contract itself, because when the feint withdraws the most basic protections, when it uses hunger as coercion, when it demands surveillance and data extraction as the price of survival, we are no longer talking about conservative governance or limited government, we are talking about social Darwinism, we are talking about a return to a pre-New Deal understanding of society, where the vulnerable simply perish and the powerful justify it, through narratives of personal responsibility and fraud prevention, and the conservative cultural and political agenda in 2025 is to dismantle what is left of the New Deal, or the Great Society, and defend unfettered free enterprise against critics and alternative, and that project requires the liquidation of any institution, any program, any protection that suggests we have obligations to one another beyond market transactions. The data collection demand is particularly sinister because it creates what scholars call database deportation, where the mere act of seeking help creates a digital trail that can be weaponized at any moment in the future. USDA published a system of records notice that creates the new federal SNAP database and outlines 11 new routine uses of the data. The USDA acknowledged the data could be disclosed to a large number of entities, including numerous entities that are not assistance programs, and for purposes other than the administration or enforcement of an assistance programs, which is bureaucratic language for we can give this information to anyone we want for whatever we want. And families understand this, which is why community organizations in cities like Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and New York report rising anxiety among families, even citizens who worry the federal request could become a backdoor immigration screen. And when citizens are afraid to access benefits they are legally entitled to because of what the government might do with that information. We have created a panopticon, we have built the infrastructure of tyranny. And I want to be very clear about what resistance looks like here, because Beshear is showing us that lawsuits work, that states have power, that governors can declare emergencies and redirect funds and mobilize National Guard troops to staff food banks, and Beshear is one of more than 24 Democratic state officials who sued the Trump administration, and they won, and U.S. District Judge Indira Talwani ruled the decision to suspend SNAP benefits was likely illegal, and in a separate case, U.S. District Judge John J. McConnell Jr. ordered the Trump administration to distribute contingency funding as soon as possible. And these legal victories matter enormously, because they establish precedent, they constrain executive overreach, they buy time for advocacy and organizing, but we also have to understand that Trump has shown zero hesitation to simply ignore court orders. Rollins announced they will stop moving federal funds despite the injunction, which means the courts alone cannot save us. This requires mass mobilization, political pressure, sustained resistance across every domain. The immigration enforcement angle reveals how these different forms of oppression interlock and reinforce each other, because the 2025 reconciliation bill largely restricts eligibility for most lawfully present immigrants except for lawful permanent residents, and new federal guidance implementing these restrictions is irresponsibly written, creating confusion about eligibility, and the goal is to make the system so Byzantine, so hostile, so surveilled, that people simply give up, that they stop trying to navigate the bureaucratic nightmare and accept their own immiseration. And this is how you engineer demographic change, through attrition, through the systematic withdrawal of life support, until whole communities become unviable and either leave or die quietly, and that is genocide, by administrative procedure, that is ethnic cleansing through welfare policy. Beshear's account of taking Trump to court multiple times, of winning, of getting partial benefits, then full benefits, then facing the Supreme Court appeal, is a roadmap for resistance, but it also reveals the exhausting, grinding nature of this fight, because federal funding for SNAP will run out on November 1, leaving around 563,080 Kentuckians facing even worse food insecurity. And every single one of these battles has to be fought in court, in state legislatures, in Congress, in the media, and the Trump administration is counting on fatigue, is counting on the fact that constant crisis eventually numbs us into accepting the unacceptable, and that we will stop noticing when children go hungry because it becomes the new normal, the background condition of American life. Look at how the administration manipulated the court process because a Department of Agriculture official said the administration intends to deplete SNAP contingency funds completely and provide reduced SNAP benefits for November 2025, with roughly $4.6 billion in reserve to cover half of eligible households' allotments, and they made this announcement only after being ordered by a judge to comply, and even then they chose the most punitive possible interpretation, providing only partial benefits when lawyers for plaintiffs argued the decision not to provide full SNAP benefits, even though they have funds available, is arbitrary and capricious, and this is how authoritarian regimes operate within the letter of the law, while violating its spirit, engineering maximum suffering within whatever constraints the courts impose. We also need to talk about the racial dimension here, because SNAP recipients are disproportionately Black and Latino, and the immigration enforcement component explicitly targets communities of color, and when Beshear's spokesperson said he believes government should be fighting hunger, not causing it, and the president should stop using the American people as a bargaining tool for his political agenda with over 600,000 Kentuckians relying on SNAP to withstand. He is speaking to the fundamental question of what government is for, and Trump's answer is clear. Government is for punishment, government is for control, government is for the enforcement of hierarchies and the protection of the powerful, and everyone else can starve if they lack utility or compliance. The national security implications are also staggering, because nearly 2/3 of the funds needed for a full month of benefits are available in SNAP's contingency fund, and must be used when regular funding runs short, and the administration must release those funds to ensure families can put food on the table, but Trump would rather save that money for hypothetical future hurricanes while creating a humanitarian disaster right now. And McConnell addressed the Trump administration's argument that contingency funds might be needed for other reasons, like in the aftermath of a hypothetical hurricane, but ruled that there could be no greater necessity than preventing irreparable harm and terror to families worried about feeding their children, and that judicial language is remarkable in its moral clarity, calling out the administration for prioritizing abstraction over actual human suffering. What this reveals is that Trump sees SNAP recipients as disposable, as expendable, as less than human, because no rational actor would choose political leverage over feeding 40 million people unless they fundamentally did not view those 40 million people as fully human, as deserving of consideration. And Rep. Morgan McGarvey said, "Don't tell me we can spend billions on aid for Argentina and a new White House ballroom, but there's no will or way to get money out the door to feed American families." And that juxtaposition is devastating because it shows exactly where the priorities lie. We have money for everything except the people who need it most, and that is not accident, that is design, that is the application of an ideology that views poverty as moral failure and suffering as deserved. The historical parallel to the New Deal dismantling is crucial, because we are watching the systematic destruction of the entire post-war social democratic consensus. Project 2025 promises to mobilize business power and champion free enterprise, and the success of these blueprints rests on political power, not popular appeal, while the New Deal and Great Society gained momentum from social movements. And what that tells us is we need mass movements, we need sustained grassroots organizing, we need the kind of political pressure that makes it impossible for elected officials to side with Trump's cruelty, because right now the balance of power favors destruction, and we need to shift that balance through collective action. Beshear is showing us courage, but he is also showing us limits, because even after winning in court, even after state intervention, state agencies will have to recode their eligibility systems to adjust for reduced benefits, and it is unclear how quickly state systems can do so, with some states seeing changes take anywhere from a few weeks to up to several months. Which means even the victories are partial, even the judicial wins result in hunger and deprivation, and that is deliberate. That is Trump calculating that some suffering is acceptable, collateral damage in his larger political project, and we need to name that. We need to make that calculation visible and morally unbearable. The constitutional crisis dimension cannot be overstated, because when a San Francisco-based federal judge barred the administration, at least for now, from collecting information, but the Agriculture Secretary just announced they are doing it anyway, we have entered territory where the rule of law is optional, where judicial review is a suggestion, and where executive power recognizes no legitimate constraints, and history tells us that regimes which stop respecting judicial authority do not stop there. They continue accumulating power, they continue eliminating checks and balances until you wake up one day in a dictatorship, and by then resistance is infinitely more costly and dangerous. What Beshear is documenting is that we are at a hinge moment in American history, where the question is whether we will tolerate a government that weaponizes basic survival needs to advance political agendas and demographic engineering, and the answer to that question will determine what kind of society we become, because if we accept that presidents can starve people, if we accept that hunger can be political leverage, if we accept that helping vulnerable families require surrendering their data for surveillance and deportation, then we have accepted premises that make fascism inevitable. We have conceded the argument before it is even fully articulated, and the ratchet only turns one direction from there, toward greater cruelty, greater repression, greater dehumanization, until we no longer recognize the country we thought we were. Resistance requires us to refuse every normalization, every accommodation, every attempt to present this as reasonable policy disagreement, because millions of Americans are about to go hungry because the federal government has chosen to withhold food assistance. It is legally obligated to provide, and SNAP is one of our most effective tools to fight hunger, and the USDA has the money to keep it running, and there is no excuse for this administration to abandon families. And that clarity that moral absolutism is what we need right now, not both sides' equivocation, not technocratic parsing of budget constraints, but the clear statement that making people hungry when you have the power and resources to feed them is evil, is indefensible, is grounds for impeachment and removal and mass civil disobedience and whatever it takes to stop it, because some things are not negotiable, and feeding children is one of them. And if we lose that, if we accept that children can be political hostages, then we have lost everything that makes us human, everything that makes society possible.